G'day there. You're watching the Aussie BIM Guru, and today I'm covering a topic that I think is really important if you're a Revit user, particularly if you're an architect, and that is mastering scheduling in Revit. Now I'm going to be focusing on architecture today. I know there's a lot more things you can do with schedules with structure and also with MEP, but just a pre-warning, that is not really my focus today. But why am I making a video on Revit? I don't make Revit videos too often, and I haven't made a mastering video for a long time. But simply put, people I see in Revit just aren't using scheduling enough. It's one of the most powerful tools that Revit gives us because it gives us a view of our data, and it also gives us an environment where we can also control our model as well by selecting things from schedules. If you use schedules right, you can actually skip a lot of Dynamo. There are a lot of people that build Dynamo scripts that could effectively be achieved through a schedule. For example, maybe you're trying to select all the walls that belong to a particular level. You can actually do that using a schedule in Dynamo. You just need to know how. So I think it's a really valuable tool. So today I'm going to aim to cover pretty much everything that I think is important to know about schedules. So today I'll be using Revit 2022, but you can pretty much use any version of Revit. All the tools I show you today have been in Revit for a really long time, which really means there's no excuse not to know them. So I hope that this is a useful session, especially if you're a beginner or a newcomer to Revit in particular. So I'm going to begin with the basics. If you've already done a bit of scheduling, you might want to skip ahead, but I'm going to make a basic room schedule and add some fields to it. We'll run through filtering a schedule, grouping and sorting it into sections, and then totaling. In this case, we'll total some areas, and then I'll have a look at some different schedules, some sheet and view lists very quickly, and then just cover the basics of design options, phasing, and managing linked elements in a schedule. So I'm just going to jump straight into Revit. Now I am using a sample project today. This is one that's not necessarily available to the public for free, but you can use any project effectively. The thing that's important here is your model has data in it that you would like to schedule. So don't run an empty model, find one with some rooms. So ideally some data, some objects. This particular project has a few links in it. So I'm just going to turn off my facade and my site and my structure, but really it's an internal model. It's a remake of the advanced sample project. There are elements that are quite data rich in my model. For example, my doors are chock full of parameters to schedule. But of course, you just want to make sure you have things that you want to schedule. That's the key. Let's begin with the rooms. So I'm just very quickly going to show you the type of information the rooms have in this model that we can work with. So if I just go and zoom in, say this cafeteria, for example. In this case, there is some briefing data that I haven't populated, but we can see I have numbers, names, departments, finish codes, various little pieces of data I've given these rooms, which is really important if you want to schedule, because you need things to schedule in the first place. So to create a basic schedule, I'm going to come to View tab, Schedules, Schedules and Quantities. I generally don't use graphical column schedules. I think they're for structure. Material takeoff, I don't use either because you have to model very accurately to get a good material takeoff, which Revit isn't really that good at. And I don't tend to use note blocks very often either. But they are a handy feature if you're doing general notes. And I do have a video on that that I'll link below. But otherwise, let's just focus on schedules and quantities. So you'll have to first pick a category of element or a multi-category schedule. We're going to come back to this multi-category schedule. So I'm just going to click and type in R, which takes me straight to R, and I'm going to go to rooms. In this case, you'll want to make sure you're targeting the intended phase. In this case, I'm going to target new construction. I have a couple of visualization phases after this one, but you probably won't in your model. Okay. So at this point, we're prompted to add some fields to our schedule. These are going to be columns in our schedule. What would you like the schedule to summarize? Well, in this case, we're firstly just going to add number is a good thing to probably begin with for rooms, name, and probably area. And I'm just going to hit OK. This will generate a room schedule, and every row that we see here is effectively an object in our model. These aren't just text. These are actually live objects. If the objects change in Revit, they also change in the schedule as well, which is really powerful. Now, to begin with, at this point, we sort of have some fields, but the schedule itself isn't very useful. It's a really good summary, but it really doesn't tell us a lot about the building. It's unsorted, it's out of order. It doesn't really help us very much. So maybe we want to first sort our schedule. So if I go to sorting and grouping, I can sort by number. Okay, that. And we'll see that now the zeros come first, the ones come second, the twos come last. It's still not that useful though. we really want to break it down into sections. So if we're scheduling rooms, often a really good way would be to break these down by level. So how do we do that? Well, in this case, we're going to group our schedule. So firstly, we have to actually add the field that we want to use to group our schedule. So in this case, I'm going to be wanting to add the level field. Once I've done that, I'm going to come back to sorting and grouping. And instead of sorting by number, I'm first going to sort by level. I'm then going to sort by number. Now, the difference with what I'm going to do here is I'm going to group these using a header. And I'm also just going to add a blank line after the header. And this is a really typical process for grouping schedules. What it will do is if I OK this, check it out, it's actually broken my schedule up into levels, which is really quick and easy. Now, there is a bit of redundancy. We have level and level sort of in the header. So let's hide the level column. So I'm going to go to formatting, level, and I'm going to tick on this hidden field box. And there we go. We effectively still have the data hiding behind the scenes in our schedule, which allows it to group the schedule as well. But now we have a schedule that is getting much closer to something that is quite useful for someone to view. So in this case, I can see I've got all my ground floor rooms, my first floor rooms, and also my second floor rooms. Now, the last thing is I don't have total areas. So why aren't they totaling? Well, it would seem quite useful, wouldn't it? Now, there's a few things usually you'll need to check in order to achieve totals. The first thing that you don't always have to do, but I do it anyway, is I go here in formatting and I go calculate totals. You can also calculate minimum, maximum, min and max. I just usually do totals. I haven't really found many use cases for min and max. I assume maybe for MEP, there might be some relation to pressure differentials or certain types of fields where you want to know the range of values. But in this case, we're just going to stick with calculate totals. I'm also going to want to go to sorting and grouping. And I'm also just going to have a footer after each level header where I also add the total. And then also the grand total, I'm going to see totals only. So you can do counts as well. We'll look at counts a bit later. But for now, if I OK that, now we should have the subtotal of each level. And we also have the grand total at the end of the schedule. So what we've done there is create a really quick summary of rooms in our model and a really quick drill down of areas totaled in the model as well. Quite useful. Now we're going to have a look at some ways to sort of group and cluster this data together in our next example, but we could always consolidate this down into a level by level schedule. I'm really quickly going to do it here, but I'll spend a little bit more time explaining how it works later. So this is how quickly you can pivot a schedule in Revit. Let's say we just want one line for each level with a total area. So in this case, I don't need name, I don't need number, I just need area and level. I'm going to explain what I'm doing here in a little bit in the next example, but I'm going to turn off Itemize, turn off the footer and the header, OK, and I've just pivoted myself into a level by level schedule. So if I just go back and turn levels on, but you can see how quickly I can really pivot my data. So sort by level, turn off blank line, bang, I have my total of levels. So once you really learn to use schedules, you can very quickly form some quite powerful queries on your model, not only as a documentation tool, but a working tool. So once you master schedules, this is how quickly and easily you will be able to view the data in your model in Revit. And the really good thing about that is it also makes the data more valuable. It makes people focus on it more if you use schedules or encourage people to use them more. So if you're a BIM manager, for example, struggling to get people to use the data in the model, teach them schedules and they'll start appreciating it. Because if they get bad data, it's not useful data. So yeah, that's pretty much another really good lesson to take in. Before we jump on, we're going to have a look at just a few little extra things. So in schedules, people don't usually know this, but you can go to the, I think it's the VG settings. Now I'm in a room schedule, so I can change my phase. That's definitely one thing I can do. As well as this, you can embed schedules. Now we're probably not going to go into this, but I can embed door schedules and things like that in here to report doors in rooms as well. Rooms are a special type of category that support this. I'm probably not going to get too deep into it, but I think you can change the visibility graphics of the view as well. Interesting that it's not giving me the option. That's probably because I don't have any design options. If I add design options to my model, then you'll also see that I gain this visibility graphic override. The only thing that's in it is design options, but it's very important to understand that you will always see what is in the primary design options unless you change this from automatic. So if you're trying to do a room schedule or a takeoff schedule, and there's elements inside secondary design options, they're not going to schedule by default. So that's really important to understand as well. Also, if you do want to pick up linked elements, you will need to make sure under fields, you've ticked on this include elements in links box, and the links will have to be loaded as well. Let's quickly make a sheet schedule just to show that in action. So I'm going to go to schedules, sheet list, and let's just make a drawing register list. Very common task. So we firstly want sheet number, probably sheet name, and maybe the current revision of the sheet as well. Now in my model, I actually have the drawing series on the sheets as well. So I'm going to use that as a sorting parameter. So I'm going to use my sort level 2 parameter. Actually, I might use my package. I'll use sort level 2 for now. No, actually, I'm going to use my package name and number. And what I'm going to do is combine these into a parameter. I'm pretty sure that should work. I'll just double check this because I don't think you can group by this parameter. I'll try it anyway. So I've got a sort level parameter, but I've also got package number and package name. So what I'm going to do is add these two parameters with a separator of a colon space and no separator after. And we'll just have a look at what this thing looks like. So you can see my package name then becomes this number, which is in one parameter. And I'll just quickly show you what these parameters actually look like. So I have, in this case, a package number and a package name parameter, and you can see that I've joined them together as a parameter together. So what I'm also going to want to do back in this schedule is probably put this as a header. Now I think, yeah, so that's one limitation with combined fields. You can't make them headers. There is a limitation there. I could try using my sort level 2 parameter, which is actually accessible. So if I sort by level 2, and make it a header as well. I didn't make it a header. Then I guess that sort of works, but I've had to put like basically double the data in place to achieve that system. So I've had to put that data in 2 places. Let's just remove that combined parameter for now. And then I also don't need my header parameter, so I'm going to hide this like before. We can see now that I've really quickly generated a great summary of the sheets in my models. Now I can also include the linked sheets as well by ticking on the include elements in links box. And now you can see that my linked sheets are coming in as well. Now it's important if you're using a parameter for sorting or grouping, it's going to have to be a shared parameter that is common to those 2 models. So this system here that I'm showing you works only because in this case I've used the same sorting parameter on my sheets in both models, which means that they can be read as the same parameter by the schedule, even though it's in a linked model. In sheet lists as well, there's one really important thing too, that if you don't want a sheet to appear in the sheet list, you can actually just tick off this appears in sheet list box. So if we see this sheet here, 10.00300, tick it on, and we can see it hides, and I can tick it back on, and it's back. So if you have like sketches in your model and you don't really want to filter them, you can always just use these appears in sheet list property as well. Having said that, you can actually filter things out. So I have some dummy sheets here that are meant to simulate some callouts in this model, but I don't really want to pick them up in this particular file. So in this case, you can see I've already ticked off appears in sheet list, but if I tick them on, then I end up with these 2 dummy sheets. Let's say I don't want to use the appears in sheet list box. Well, I can also use a filter. So if I come up to filter, I can set the criteria for what elements should and shouldn't show. Now it's worth noting I only have the ability to do AND conditions, and I only have, I think, 8 of them. So that is a pretty big limitation in schedules. It's not like view filters where you have more flexibility. Let's say I want to filter by sort level 2, does not equal, and in this case you can see I get all the values to pick from. Maybe let's instead go by sheet. I don't want dummy sheets. So I could go by sort level, I could do sort level 1, which is the O2 dummy sheets. That's probably better, but let's just say the sheet name is our criteria. So I want to say that if the sheet name contains, now I have to be careful here. If I do this, it's actually only going to show me the sheets that do contain that. So what I want to do here is actually set up a does not contain condition so that it shows me everything whose sheet name does not contain dummy. And we'll see that if I come down to 54, I can't see my dummy sheets anymore. So if someone in my model accidentally forgets to tick on or off the appears in sheet list property box, it doesn't matter. The filter will pick up these things anyway. So it's up to you how you want to filter and manage your schedules, but there's a few options, I guess. So we've sort of covered the basics in this case, the 101 as I call it. So let's move on to a little bit more complicated scheduling. In this case, we're going to have a look at a multi-category schedule, and we're going to look at it filtered by room. We're going to do a little bit of review of what I call data completion, or the need for data to be present to schedule well, because we're going to be trying to do an equipment list in a room. So obviously all of our equipment needs good data to schedule. I'll quickly look at room reporting, how that works, and how we can filter by a particular room in a schedule. We're then going to look at counts and itemization or de-itemization, which I sort of did before with the room scheduling, but I said I'll come back to it. So this is where we're going to focus on it. It's one of the most powerful techniques in scheduling in Revit. Then we'll have a quick look at formatting, headers, footers, and finally how you can use these schedules to select elements in the model. So I'm jumping back into Revit now, and now we're getting a little bit more complicated. So I'm just going to focus in on a particular room in my model. Let's say that I want to schedule all the components in a typical disabled bathroom in this project. So I have this room here, and its number is 00.ame-02. Let's now create a multi-category schedule that will pick up more than just one category. The reason I want to do this is that there are things in different categories I want to schedule together. For example, the shower curtain is furniture, the drain is plumbing fixtures, the grab rails are specialty equipment, so we can't just use one category to pick up all these elements together. So I'm going to go and create a schedule, but this time I'm going to pick a multi-category schedule instead. I'm then going to make sure I'm targeting the right phase. Now we're going to start adding a few things, but the first thing we want to do is filter down by room so you can actually pick other categories up in this select available field from tab. And I'm going to pick, in this case, room. I'm going to filter by room number. And we're immediately just going to come over to filter and say that room number equals, and I'm going to pick 00AME-02. I'm then also just going to pick, I'll probably leave it with that for now, and we'll have a look at what we get. So we're going to get just a whole bunch of room numbers, which obviously doesn't help very much. So now we want to look at data completion. What fields can we actually schedule together? So I actually use my own content. It's very detailed, and I use a lot of custom parameters. So in this case, at the least, you're going to want to have a code and a comment or a description, something to describe the object. So you can see here I populate both description and a copy of that parameter as well, a shared parameter that can work cross-category. So in this case, I'm going to target my comment parameter and my code parameter, which is also linked to my keynote parameter. So in this case, we'll go back to our schedule and we're going to add some fields. So I'm now going to add, in this case, code and comment. And you're going to see fields in this list that are either project or shared parameters, which we'll talk about a little bit later, or they can just be in at least one valid family to show up in that list. So just because you see a field in that list on the left doesn't mean that every single thing in your schedule is going to have it. That's one thing to be really aware of. I'm also going to sort, in this case, by code. Okay, now it's getting a little bit better. Now we're starting to pick up a few things that we probably don't want. For example, I have a no schedule code when I don't want to schedule something. I use this for assembly objects that hold other objects together. We're also getting some blank elements that don't have a code. And we've also picked up the door. So some of these things aren't really ideal. So we can start to filter. Now we can either use an inclusion filter or an exclusion filter. If I just wanted to target all my furniture, you'll notice all the furniture in my system is F dot. Now this is the value of designing your data systems to work well. In my case, I made some very early decisions in my system design where I said all my furniture and fixtures will begin with F dot. All my joinery will be J dot. All my services will be X dot. And that really helps me move my data very quickly, filter it, do all sorts of things with it, both in Revit and also in Dynamo. Not everyone makes those choices in companies, so you have to be careful. Now, unfortunately, we actually have to schedule out everything else. We can't say contains this or that. unfortunately. So in this case, I'm actually going to be turning off anything that is no shed, anything that is empty, or anything that is D dot. So in this case, I'm going to go to fields. So to hide empty things, all we have to do is say that code has a value. Immediately, empty fields are gone. You can also say that code is greater than an empty field. Both methods will work. As well as this, I'm now going to hide anything that begins with D dot. I could also just do D, actually, and I might just do that. And also we're going to hide anything whose code equals no schedule. And there it is. I've obviously filtered a little bit too heavily there. So in this case, we want to say does not begin with, my bad, and does not equal. So I wasn't too careful there. There we go. And now we're just left with the things that we care about. So if I just make this a little bit bigger, we're now starting to look at an equipment list. Now the next thing we want to do is, well, we're reporting some things multiple times, like we have two hooks reporting together. That's not very efficient. Wouldn't it be better to say that we have two hooks instead of we have one hook and we have one hook? Let's find a way to bring them together. So in this case, I'm just going to go to fields, and I'm firstly just going to hide room number so that we don't see it. It's just being used behind the scenes. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you one of the most powerful techniques in Revit scheduling. Under sorting and grouping, there is this tick box that says itemize every instance. So what this tick box is telling the schedule to do is that every object is going to be a row. Now in this case, if every object is not a row and we have no sorting on our filter, we're just going to see one cell or one row that tells us that this row varies. But what that row represents is every object in the schedule. So let's add a sorting mechanism based on code. We'll see now we're only going to see one hook. This row actually represents the two objects that are sorted and grouped into that manner. So what I can do now is add a special field to my schedule called count. And this is an inbuilt schedule in Revit that will tell rows to count the number of objects in them. I also like to usually come to count and calculate totals. I think it doesn't need to be done, but I just prefer to do it. And check it out, this row actually knows it has two things in it. So what we're starting to do now is create a quantity takeoff of objects in this particular room. So pretty powerful, right? We've effectively started to create an equipment list for this space. And the only limitation with this setup is obviously you need one schedule per room with a filter changed each time. It's not like a keynote list where you can put it on the sheet and it knows to report what it sees. There is the ability to filter schedules by view, I think in Revit 23 onwards, or it might be 24 actually, but I don't like it because it schedules everything it can see, which often means it schedules things outside the view you would want to actually pick up. So it's sort of like a semi-functional feature, but also not quite a functional feature. So there we go. That's pretty much the basis of how you can set up a multi-category schedule. Now in this case, I'll just have a very quick look at formatting this schedule. And there's a few things you can do to format a schedule in Revit. Most of them are contained under the Appearance tab. So you can do things such as change the lines of the schedule, add an outline around the edge. You can put a blank row before the data, or just tell it to start straight away. So you can see now the headers are right next to each other. I can also do row striping as well, which will either show it just in the view or on the sheet as well. So in this case, that might help you read your schedule a bit more easily. As well as this, we can turn off the title, which often is helpful. We can show the headers, but we can also change the types of fonts we use for things. So maybe I want to make my headers bold, for example. And it starts to look a little bit cleaner. Now I can also do controls per column up the top. So let's say I want to make sure this is always center justified, this is always left justified, and center justified. And I can start to format this. Now I can also change these things. I can say this is actually called code. This is actually called description. And let's say I want to call this quantity, CTY or QTY. Now what happens here is it actually just goes to the formatting tab for us and changes the override. Behind the scenes, the parameter is still called code. It hasn't changed anything about it, but you can see that these formats have also changed here as well. So you can either do it from the top, which I find easier, or you can do it in here. What you can also do is take these headers and you can actually group them together. And I can say information, for example, and I can align that to the left or the center or wherever I want to. So I can start to really change and muck around with these if I want to. I can freeze my header. I can also shade them. So if I want these all to be, say, black, I can highlight the cells, say that these are all black, and then highlight them again and say that they're font. Now in this case, if you want white font, you've got to trick Revit. You've got to make it 254, 254, 254, just off white, and that will allow it to be white. And there we go. I can also ungroup my header. I can hide columns, which again sort of shortcuts you to the formatting tab. But you can see I've got a good amount of control over the way this schedule is going to look on a sheet. So let's say we want to actually put this on a sheet. This is the last thing usually you do with a schedule. In this case, I have some sheets for these views. So if I just have a look for call out plans, I think I've already got a schedule like this on these sheets, but let's say we want to schedule this actual room. I can open my sheet and you can see I've already built some little equipment lists already, but I can also just drag and drop that thing on a sheet. Not that one, that one. And there we go. We can see that my graphic overrides are picked up and there's my schedule, and I can change the size on the sheet as well if I want to. I can split the schedule. I can also split the schedule across sheets as well if I want to. That's an option they added in later builds of Revit. So I can actually drag and drop this across different sheets if I want to between. But we can see we've just created a very powerful multi-category schedule. So the last thing on this particular topic is I can actually select things across this schedule. So let's say I just go back to my floor plan and I do WT for window tile. Let's say I just want to really quickly select like the mirror. Well, there we go. I just selected the element in Revit by selecting the row. I can actually use this as a powerful tool to interrogate my model. Let's say that I want to go back to my room schedule and I want to just select all rooms on the ground floor. Well, again, I'll just go ground floor, window tile, select the row, bang. I just selected all 50 rooms on ground floor, and I have the ability to modify them, do whatever I want to them. So this is a really powerful feature of schedules as well. This is what makes schedules a little bit like Dynamo, in that you can actually go and select groups of elements, make changes to them in bulk, and sometimes you don't even need Dynamo for those types of tasks. So there we go. They're getting a little bit more advanced. So the next topic we're going to cover, and I do have a more thorough video on my channel, so I won't go too deep on it, is key schedules. Key schedules are a really powerful control mechanism in Revit to make sure that things can be templated from a data perspective. So I'll firstly just show you shared and project parameters, the difference between them, how you can make sure that elements have parameters regardless of whether their family does, and then we'll set up a basic key schedule, apply the keys to elements, and we'll just show that it's possible to copy schedules between projects as well. So shared parameters, really important in typical Revit models. If I go to manage project parameters, anything you see here with the BG is a shared parameter. So pretty much all of them are shared parameters. And the good thing about this is it ensures that even if an element doesn't have a particular parameter at the project level, it will regardless. So let's say, for example, you know, this maybe this hand dryer doesn't have the code parameter that all my other families use. Let's say it's just not there. It has a keynote, but it doesn't have a code. I'm going to load this back in the project. And if I actually go in the hand dryer, in this case, it probably won't quite be where I expect it to be. There it is. It's not quite in the same position, but it still has the parameter. How did this happen? Well, and I'm just going to give it that code very quickly as well. That's because I've also added code as a project parameter. So under modify, I've made sure that all the typical elements I would give a code to still have that parameter at a project level. So even if some families do have the parameter and some families don't, as long as you have it as a project parameter, all families will have at least a project level copy of that parameter to work with. So if you're using very common scheduling parameters, it is a good idea to usually make sure they're project parameters as well, so that if you do load in a piece of content that's not quite to your system, it will still be very easy to just give it the data it needs to fall in line with your scheduling approach. So I'd always recommend considering that before you work with things like key schedules, for example, where elements may not always have the data that you need available when they come in the project. So key schedules. Let's just set up a basic key schedule. Let's say that I want to template the finishes that my rooms use in their ceiling, wall, and floor finish properties. Let's say I want to create a typical wet areas finish scheme, and I want to make sure that I can just control this in one place rather than having to do it manually in each area of the model. So if I go to View, Schedules, Schedules and Quantities, I'm going to want to make a room schedule. But the key difference I'm going to do here, bad pun, is I'm going to click on Schedule Keys and give this a key. And I'm just going to call this Finish Key. I'll call this Room Finishes Key as a schedule name. You'll see that there's no phase anymore, it's not relevant. And we can now add some fields. Now, since 2022, we've been able to add shared parameters in here as well. But you'll see by default, we have a key name. That's going to be the actual field that we pick that will push the data for the other fields that we give to the key. So let's say we first want floor, wall, and ceiling. I'm going to go OK. So this is a special schedule. It's different to a normal schedule. It's not going to show us elements in the model. Instead, it's going to show us keys that we can apply to elements. So we actually have the ability to insert data rows here. So let's go 1, 2. Let's make 2 keys. I'm just going to call this one typical wet area. And let's call this one typical corridor. I can now pick from the values already in the model in this field. So in this case, I'm going to say typical wet area uses floor tiles, its wall finish is wall tile, and its ceiling finish is plasterboard. A typical corridor, its floor finish will be carpet, its wall finish will be wall plasterboard, and ceiling finish will be a combination of plasterboard and tile. Now if I go into the model and I go to this WC, somewhere in here we're going to see our finish key. So I'm just going to find it. There it is, finish key. Currently set to none. But now I have these 2 keys that I've just created. So if I go typical wet area, check it out. Our keys just locked in the values for these properties. And if I change them, you can see they quickly align to match this, which is really powerful, right? Like that's a very powerful feature if you use it right. Now, until recent versions, I believe when you used to go back to none, the values used to lose their data as well. But in, I think, 2022, they fixed it. So I can see here that now we have typical wet area, typical corridor. I can very quickly apply schemes to these rooms. Now I can also use this room schedule to bulk apply things as well, which is pretty powerful. So let's go fields, and we have our finish key, and let's just add name. I'm going to sort by name and de-itemize, no totals, okay. And I can now very quickly say, hey, all WCs, your wet areas. And what I'm doing here is I'm actually bulk applying based on room name. Let's say all corridors, your corridors, and you're locked into the key. And what that's actually done is I've just went and bulk applied using the key, all that data to those elements. So what you've seen there is a very powerful means of applying data in a Revit model. But you can see I had to set up a couple of systems in order to achieve that. But once I've got them, it's so quick to push data around the model. So schedule keys are really valuable, and I highly encourage firms to consider how they can take advantage of them. There are other ways you can use them. For example, maybe your doors are instance-based. You can use a key to set a door size range, 920 by 2040, 820 by 2040, etc., etc. There are some really interesting ways you can apply these. You could use area conversion rates for area scheming. So all sorts of ways you can take advantage of this. So hopefully that's a very useful technique, a very powerful one, but a very advanced one. I can also copy schedules. I might just quickly show that that's possible. Some people aren't aware that I can just go right click. Let's just copy the finishes scheme, make a new project. So I right click to clipboard, just make a new empty project. You want to focus Revit on nothing and just Control B. And bang, I've just got a room finishes key system sitting in the model, ready to go. So it's very easy to copy these across as well if you're trying to template or set up systems across multiple models. So hopefully that's a powerful technique as well. We're now going to look at, in this case, takeoff scheduling. This is a very popular request. I have some videos on this topic on the channel. If you have a look through my Dynamo playlist, that will go in a lot more depth on this particular topic. Now I'm just going to set up a very basic example of setting up a takeoff system in this case. So I'm just going to go back to Revit. Let's say I want to do a takeoff of all the floors in my model. So the first thing I'm actually going to want to do is set the cost of all the floor types in my model. So some elements in Revit do and don't have cost-based parameters. Let's just jump back to a 3D view and have a look at some of the elements in my model. A floor, for example, will have an inbuilt cost parameter called cost. Now it's up to you whether you use this parameter or your own parameter, because some elements won't support the inbuilt cost parameter depending what they are. Let's just use the inbuilt cost parameter for now to keep things simple. But what we also need is actually a parameter that tells this thing how to be measured, because you're not going to measure everything in the same way. Some things will be meters squared, some things will be linear meterage, some will be volume, and some will be quantity or each. So what I like to do usually is add a parameter to the project that can do this. So I'm going to go Manage, Project Parameters, Add. And from my shared parameter file, I've already set up a parameter that is here for takeoff. Code takeoff is what I call it. So in this case, it's a text-based parameter that I can just apply to pretty much everything in my model. And I'll just make sure actually that's meant to be a type parameter. Whoops. Shared parameter, code takeoff, type, anything that supports it. And now if I come back to this floor, somewhere in here, I think it's under text, I can now tell this element, you're measured on a meters squared basis. That's how you need to be measured. The reason why this data is useful is when you go to things like Dynamo, you can start to set up pathways in your script where you filter out all the things that should be measured by area, all the things that should be measured by linear meterage, etc. And you can combine this data regardless of the way the elements are measured. I'll show a very basic example of that at the end. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to make a control schedule for floors so I can very quickly populate this data. So I'm just going to, in this case, go make a schedule by type. I'm going to add, in this case, the cost rate and the takeoff code. To begin with, I'm just going to de-itemize by all. Now I want these all to be measured by meter squared. So whilst they're all together in one row, I'm going to push this down to the types, which is what Revit's telling me. So with one change, I've now successfully bulk populated a parameter. If I sort by type now, bang, I just did 4 things at once. Now let's say carpet is 50 meters squared, $50 per meter squared. Vinyl finish is 35. Tiles are 70. And tile 2 is maybe a feature tile. It's 90. It's quite expensive. What I've done there is just push this into the type properties of these floors. Now with the same floor, I can pivot this into a floor cost takeoff. So if I go to fields, now let's just think about how we want to sort this schedule. I'm just going to take everything out. In this case, I'm going to firstly add the code of the floor. Now in this case, we've got to sort by it as well. There's my 3 types of codes. Now, the challenge here is I've actually got a bit of a more complex system here. I might use Keynote instead because I sort of use my Keynote as my combined code field. So I have a system code and then I have an item code. Actually, they're all the same Keynote. That's fine. I might have a type mark as well. As you can see, you can put codes in a lot of places in Revit now, so I'm using Keynote in this case. From there, I might want to put the comment as well. And this is where it gets a little bit more interesting. What I'm going to do is add my code. Now this is very much just my system here. And then I have a system code as well. And then I'm going to sort by code and by system. So I can see I've got carpet 1, vinyl 1, tile 2. What I can also do if I want to put these together without making people aware of what's happening, I can actually combine these together if I want to. So code and system. with a dash between them. And then I can just hide the actual code and the actual system parameter. And that lets me sort of put them together without the user on the surface really seeing what's going on behind the scenes. Now I know the cost and I know the area of these now. So let's add the area and let's add the cost. So I can see my area is currently not being totaled. So remember, we come to formatting, area, calculate totals. And there we go. We now see the total square meterage of each of those. We have a cost rate. Now let's change the formatting of the way that cost looks. Let's make it a dollar symbol. So I'm going to go to field formatting. Let's do 0 decimal places with the Australian dollar sign. And there we go. We can see a nice little cost. Finally, now we're going to use what's called a calculated field here. This is a field based on other fields in a formula. So I'm going to click on the calculated field property, and I'm going to make this total cost. I can now say this is a currency, and the formula, you can either type it yourself or you can pick parameters from a list. So this is going to be the area multiplied by the cost. Okay, I've got a inconsistent unit, so that's interesting. I mean, it should definitely at least be able to support cost. Might have to divide it by 1. Yeah, okay, so sometimes if you have a unit-based field and you need to turn it into a number, you need to at least divide it by 1 of its own unit. By default, Revit will let you divide, and then it sorts out the unit for you. So you can see what happened there is it divided by 1, and then it went, oh, you're an area. Divide the unit out. So in this case, it's divided it by 1 meter squared. Just a bit of a little workaround there. If you want, you can also force order of operations with brackets. But we can see now that's my total cost, which I then need to total, field format, 0 decimal places with the Australian dollar symbol. And now I have a combined cost takeoff. The last thing we need, of course, is the actual total. Bang. I know how much my floors cost me. $200,000. My gosh, that's a lot of floor. I think I made my carpets a little bit too expensive. But the cool thing is that I can still come and just modify the cost of this type of carpet here. And I can very quickly play around and test with numbers and say, oh, what if I pick a vinyl that's this much? And you can see the schedule is dynamically updating as I go. Very cool. So it's a powerful tool for cost takeoff. If you have mixed mediums of cost takeoff, you will need to use something like Dynamo to bring them all together. I'll very quickly show you how you can form a query to get all the relevant elements in your model. Let's in this case say that we have something that we want to measure by a different rate. So let's, for example, say that I want to measure a wall by lineal meterage. Let's say in this case, this wall type, IWPA-04, is going to be measured instead under its cost takeoff by LM, or lineal meterage. So I'm just going to boot up Dynamo, and we're going to form a query to get all the elements in our model, which is a very heavy query. There are much better ways to do it than this. Or I might just get all my floors and all my walls. I know the categories of things that I want to cost, so let's just limit it down a little bit. So in Dynamo, I'm going to make a new script, go to manual, I'm going to get a category by name, and I'm just going to make a list, and I'm going to get all the floors and all the walls, which should get me my floor and my wall category, and then I'll use the all elements of category. And there we go. Now at this point we have all the instances of the elements. We don't have all the types. So what I'm going to have to do is actually I'm going to have to get my types. I'm just going to flatten this into a list of all the elements together. And I'm going to use a get parameter value by name node. Now I'm going pretty quickly here. I'm not trying to teach you Dynamo from the ground up. So it's going to be a little bit fast for most people. So bg.cost, I think it's cost rate. I'll just check the name of that parameter actually. Code takeoff 1. There we go. Now the problem now is I've asked for a parameter that's the type has. So what I actually need to do is get another parameter value by name. And I actually want to get the type of the element instead, and then get the type's takeoff rate. And I should see now that I'm getting that takeoff rate. Now in this case, I'm going to filter these elements apart by whether they're LM or M2. So what I'm going to do now is filter by Boolean mask. And there's a few ways I could go about this actually. I'll keep it simple for now. I'm just going to filter down my list based on whether the takeoff rate, TR, is LM. And also whether the takeoff rate is M2. So takeoff rate, if it equals LM, then we should see some elements make it through the in list. In this case, we can see all those walls, the instances of the walls have come through. Maybe I also want to filter down the ones that are based on M2. And there should be all my floors with an M2 rate supported. Now we could also just use a couple of extra Boolean masks to get the last piece of data that we need about the type, which is the cost. So I might also get the cost of these items. Now the problem at the moment is that wall doesn't actually have a cost yet. Let's give it a cost. Let's say the cost rate is per linear meter, it's $80. Okay, so I'm also going to need to filter that cost for LM and also filter that cost for M2. So now I have the cost and the element. Now I actually need to then ask the element, okay, what is your length and what is your area? So that's why we've had to filter these apart. I'm now going to ask all those walls, what is your length? Now these are instances, so I'm asking each instance its length. I can now see how long each of those walls is. Now that's in millimeters, so I might want to divide that by 1000 because it's a meter, linear meter rate, so we have to be careful. And I'm going to multiply that by its cost rate. And now I have the total cost, and I can just do a sum. And similarly to a schedule, I've just created a total linear or meterage cost of all the walls that have supported cost data in the model of the LM type. Likewise, I can copy this block, and I can then say, okay, what is the area of these floors? And in this case, I'm using square meters, so I don't have to divide by 1000. Then I take the cost rate, and I can now see, okay, I have $128,000 of flooring as well. And it should line up to the schedule value as well. And there's the same value in the schedule. So Dynamo can also be used if you have enough data to tell your elements how to be scheduled. And you can combine all this data together into schedules that come out of Revit as well. So I might also just quickly, before we wind up, and I'll just quickly save that. I'll just show you how you can actually get your schedules into Excel. So I'm going to go to File, Export, Reports, Schedule, and I'm just going to save this as a CSV or a CSV file, comma separated value file. Now I could do a text delimited file as well. It's up to you. So in this case, you can pick your delimiter. It doesn't have to be a comma. It can be a tab. I prefer tabs because sometimes you might use comments in other fields. And you can also add qualifiers as well for what is text. Now, if I open up Excel and I jump to my desktop, I've got this file. Now I can't drag and drop it, but I can make a new workbook and drag it onto that. Now by default, that's, a little bit messy, isn't it? It's not quite right. So what I want to do actually is open that file, and Excel should detect this is a delimited file for me. If I go to desktop, I go to all files, floor schedule. Okay, it didn't actually do it. So it's struggling with the tab delimited nature of the file. I might just keep it as comma separated value instead. So I think it's struggling to process the changes I made. Let's just export that again. I think because it's a CSV with a tab delimiter, that doesn't typically help it. So let's try again, but this time just keep it as commas so that Excel understands what to do with it. Let's try again. And there we go. Now it knows how to process this file. And we can see I've just got the same data out of Revit available for scheduling. Now, of course, some things aren't quite right. Some things seem to have... you see the delimiter hasn't quite worked here. So that's not great. So you can see I'm getting a little bit of munted formatting because of the commas. So maybe it is better to export as a TSV or a tab separated file. So I'm going to just do text delimited for now. And we'll use a tab instead. And I think Excel should now prompt us to process this file on entry. Floor schedule. Okay, drag and drop. Okay, it didn't prompt us. Great. Let's try opening instead. There is a menu that's meant to pop up, generally. So let's see if it plays ball. Okay, it's just not playing ball today. Sometimes there's a delimiting menu that pops up in that process. It doesn't seem to be happening in this particular case, but there is a qualifier that's coming in this case, and that is a tab. So if I copy this and I go to data, text to columns, this is the menu usually you're meant to see. And I'm going to delimit by tab, finish. Yes. And there we go. We can see that that's just broken everything up by the tab delimiter. Usually that menu is meant to pop up when you open a file like this, but for some reason my Excel decided it wasn't going to do that. Now there's a bit of data missing here, so it seems to have already tried to delimit itself on entry, which is a little bit frustrating. Yeah, it's still doing the comma separated delimiting, which is frustrating. So it seems like, yeah, there's a bit of funkiness going on with my Excel here. But generally, the TXT method works. Now, the alternative is you can also get the schedule data using Dynamo. You will need a custom package for this. I have a node in Crumple. Bimorph Nodes has one as well. So let's just get the current view using current document, active view. Whoops, active view to get my schedule. And under Crumple, Revit, this is my custom package. I can then go for my data as text or data as values, schedule, and I can get my data this way as well. I can then concatenate these together. Sorry, I can join these together as strings. And I'll join them together with a delimiter, which I'll use a tab. And there it is. And then I'll join these together using a return or an enter. And that creates basically the set of data that you'd want to feed into Excel. So in this case, I can use a clipboard copy or clipboard send, go to manual, plug in the data, run, open Excel, new document, paste, and there it is, delimited successfully. So that's maybe a more robust alternative, but it does use some custom nodes and a package to achieve it. But hopefully that's just an example of how you can start to look at cost takeoff, calculated fields, and really master scheduling for good. But that's really pretty much what I wanted to cover today. So we've covered a lot of things in Revit in scheduling. So well done if you made it this far. I hope you find it useful. All of my stuff can usually be found over in GitHub. There's not really anything from today on the GitHub, but usually there will be. So I hope you found that useful, and maybe it encourages you to explore and apply scheduling more in your day-to-day workflows. Thanks for watching. As always, you can contact me through email or in the comments below, and if you have any requests, let me know. I look forward to seeing you in future similar videos, and happy scheduling. Thanks. Take care. Bye.